There was once a kingdom that possessed a weapon feared by all its enemies, yet it collapsed because a single secret was placed in the wrong hands. As history approached the final phase of the Hung King's era, Van Lang was no longer a fully functioning state, but the lingering survival of an exhausted old order. Central authority had weakened, tribal leaders were becoming increasingly autonomous, while the regional environment was rapidly changing with the rise of larger political entities to the north. Van Lang was not defeated in a decisive battle. Instead, it gradually dissolved from within its own structure. It was in this context that Thuy Van emerged. He was not a figure who appeared from nothing, but the leader of the Au Viet community, a population with strong military organization living in the northern highlands and midland regions. Unlike the Lac lords, who governed largely through hereditary customs, Thuy Van represented a more centralized, disciplined model of power, one better suited to an age of warfare. The replacement of the Hung kings by Thuy Van should not be interpreted through later moral frameworks of usurpation. At that time, political legitimacy had not yet taken on its later feudal meaning. This transition reflected a change in leadership models when the old system could no longer protect the community. Thuy Van unified the Au Viet and Lac Thiet peoples, assumed the title An Duong Vuong, and named the state Au Lac, a name that itself reveals an effort at integration rather than the elimination of one group by another. The significance of An Duong Vuong did not lie merely in claiming kingship, but in his conception of state organization. For the first time in early Vietnamese history, political authority was no longer based solely on lineage or ritual belief, but closely tied to military power, territorial control, and the capacity to defend against external threats. This marked a transition from a loose tribal confederation to an early strategic state. Yet this very advance placed An Duong Vuong before a critical dilemma: how to defend a vast, densely populated lowland region that lay fully exposed to outside forces. Retreating into the mountains would have ensured safety, but isolation. Remaining in the plains promised prosperity, but invited invasion. An Duong Vuong chose the more difficult path, to stay in the lowlands and confront history directly. That choice led to a decision symbolic of an entire era: the construction of a capital unlike anything previously seen in ancient Vietnamese history. When An Duong Vuong decided to establish a new capital, he was not merely choosing a place to reside. He was answering the most critical question facing Au Lac: how could the state survive long-term on a vast, open plain where every invasion route led directly to its heartland? The Red River Delta lacked high mountains for natural defense and deep forests for strategic retreat, yet it was the core of settlement, agriculture, and trade for early Vietnamese communities. Abandoning the lowlands would have meant cutting the state off from the very resources that sustained it. Remaining there meant accepting direct confrontation with war. Co Loa was not chosen by chance. Located at the intersection of ancient river systems, it allowed control over both waterways and land routes, offering economic advantages alongside significant military potential, if properly organized. Yet this same location posed severe challenges. The soft alluvial soil and dense network of rivers made the construction of large-scale defensive works nearly beyond the technical experience of early Vietnamese society. Legend tells that the walls were built during the day, only to collapse by night. Behind this seemingly mythical image lies a concrete historical reality. This was the first attempt by the ancient Vietnamese to construct a permanent center of power on a grand scale, requiring levels of engineering, coordination, and labor mobilization never before achieved. The walls failed not only because the ground was unstable, but because the society itself was learning how to function as a state. The appearance of the golden turtle in the legend marks the moment when a solution was found. More than a divine creature, the golden turtle symbolizes indigenous knowledge accumulated over generations, an understanding of water flows, terrain, wind directions, and how to align construction with natural forces. Built in a spiral configuration with multiple concentric walls reinforcing one another, Co Loa finally stood firm in the open plains, creating depth of defense while slowing and disorienting any advancing enemy. This multi-layered structure was not only a military design, but also a reflection of political thought. Each ring of the citadel represented a controlled space, from residential areas to the administrative and military core of the state. It marked a clear transition toward a more complex social order, where power was stratified rather than based solely on kinship ties or ritual authority. Later archaeological discoveries, ranging from the scale of the fortifications and settlement remains to weapons and tools, have confirmed that Co Loa was a real construction, built through large-scale resource mobilization and centralized labor. These findings demonstrate that An Duong Vuong was not merely a legendary figure, but the ruler of a state capable of executing major public works, controlling territory, and maintaining order. Yet no matter how formidable the walls of Co Loa were, An Duong Vuong understood that earthworks alone could not be the final answer. A great capital standing in an open delta would inevitably attract more powerful and ambitious enemies. High walls could delay an assault, but they could not determine the outcome of a prolonged conflict. From this realization emerged the need for a decisive advantage, something that would not only hinder the enemy's approach, but inspire fear even when they stood at the gates. In the mindset of the ancient world, such an advantage could not be expressed in technical terms, but had to be embodied in myth, a special weapon, a state secret, a power that existed only as long as it was absolutely protected. This is where the legend of the Magic Crossbow begins. Even after the citadel of Co Loa stood firmly in the open plains, Au Lac was not yet truly secure. An Duong Vuong understood that fortifications, no matter how strong, only had meaning when paired with a military advantage powerful enough to deter any challenger. A young state could not rely on numbers or long-standing battlefield experience. Au Lac needed a form of power that would make its enemies hesitate before daring a second attempt. In legend, that power was known as the Magic Crossbow. Ancient stories tell of the golden turtle granting its claw to An Duong Vuong to fashion the trigger of the crossbow, allowing a single shot to kill many enemies at once. Yet, behind the divine imagery lies a clear military reality. Au Lac possessed a weapon or tactical technology superior to those of its contemporaries. This may have been a multi-bolt crossbow or a rapid-firing, high-impact mechanism that created overwhelming advantage at decisive moments on the battlefield. The true significance of the Magic Crossbow did not lie in its raw lethality, but in its strategic effect. A weapon capable of neutralizing multiple targets in a short time fundamentally altered the calculus of invasion. When attackers could not approach the walls or maintain formation, the already multi-layered defenses of Co Loa turned the capital into a fortress that was nearly impossible to breach. In this sense, the Magic Crossbow was not merely a weapon, it was a state secret. The legend's emphasis on the carefully guarded trigger reveals an early understanding that military power depends not only on possessing technology, but on controlling access to it. While the secret remained intact, Au Lac was stronger than its apparent capabilities. Once the secret was exposed, that strength vanished immediately. This is why the Magic Crossbow is remembered as a sacred object in folk memory, not to deify the weapon itself, but to stress that it was untouchable, undisclosable, and never to be used carelessly. Through myth, early Vietnamese society transmitted a lesson about national security. Power must be protected as rigorously as it is wielded. Thanks to the Magic Crossbow, Trio Da's forces suffered repeated defeats. This detail is crucial,
for it shows that Au Lac did not fall because of weak will or inadequate defenses. At this stage, An Duong Vuong stood at the height of his authority. Co Loa was secure, the magic crossbow was unmatched, and the state seemed to have found a formula for long-term survival. Yet it was precisely then that a historical paradox emerged. Absolute power, when not accompanied by mechanisms to control human behavior, becomes a fatal vulnerability. The magic crossbow was guarded as a sacred object, but the people around it, living in peace, were not prepared with a level of political awareness equal to the power they possessed. Militarily, Au Lac was ahead of its time. Institutionally, and in terms of political consciousness, however, it remained a young state. When conflict shifted from direct confrontation to strategy and deception, the magic crossbow ceased to be an absolute shield. Any secret, no matter how well guarded, if entrusted solely to personal loyalty rather than a system of protection, is bound to be exploited. And at this moment, a more dangerous opponent emerged, not at the gates of Co Loa, but within the political space of Au Lac itself. This was Trio Da, who understood that to defeat Co Loa, there was no need to destroy its walls, only to dismantle the trust that protected the magic crossbow. From here, history entered a different phase. The struggle was no longer fought with swords and armies, but through marriage alliances, infiltration, and intelligence. And it was at this point that the tragedy of Au Lac truly began to take shape.
When Chil Da's forces repeatedly advanced toward Co Loa, only to be forced to withdraw, these failures did not make him reckless. On the contrary, they compelled Chil Da to confront a clear reality. Au Lac was not an opponent that could be subdued through conventional military force. The multi-layered defenses of Co Loa, combined with the overwhelming advantage of the magic crossbow, rendered every direct assault costly and futile. Under such conditions, continued attacks would only drain resources without producing a decisive outcome. Chil Da was a rare figure in this period of history, one who clearly understood the limits of military power. As the founder of the state of Nam Viet, he was not merely a general, but a pragmatic political strategist who viewed warfare as one instrument within the broader management of power. When swords and armies proved ineffective, Chil Da shifted to a different form of confrontation, quieter, longer term, and far more dangerous. He chose peace. But this peace was not surrender, it was a change of battlefield. Chil Da proposed reconciliation with Au Lac, accepted diplomatic relations, and even arranged for his son, Thuy, to marry Princess Mi Chau and reside in Co Loa. To a young state like Au Lac, the proposal appeared to promise stability, security, and an end to war. To Chil Da, it was a direct passage into the very center of his rival's power. His strategy rested on a precise assessment. The greatest strength of Au Lac lay not in its numbers, but in its secrets, and those secrets were not protected by institutions, but by personal trust. When a state places its military survival in the hands of a few individuals, it creates vulnerabilities that an adversary can exploit. This political marriage was therefore a flawless move. Without breaching the walls or destroying the crossbow, Chil Da only needed time. Time to observe, to infiltrate, and to wait for the moment that peace caused vigilance to fade. In this context, Thuy entered Co Loa not as an invader, but as a member of the royal household, someone trusted, confided in, and gradually granted access to what should have remained absolutely secret. Here, Chil Da's strategy of victory without battle reached its peak. He did not shatter Co Loa from the outside, but allowed it to fracture from within. There was no need to defeat An Duong Vuong on the battlefield. It was enough to make him believe that war had ended. Once vigilance disappeared, even the greatest military advantage became meaningless. Chil Da understood a ruthless rule of history. A nation is strongest when it remains cautious, and weakest when it believes itself secure. For this reason, Chil Da did not rush. He waited until the state's most vital secret was no longer treated as a matter of survival,
until peace blurred the boundary between nation and family. Only then did Chau prepare for his final move. Yet, for this strategy to succeed, it required more than the will of a king in the north. It depended on real people, genuine emotions, and a tragedy formed within the walls of Co Loa itself. From this point, history ceased to be a story of states and armies and narrowed into the fate of two young individuals, one carrying a political mission, the other raised in peace, unfamiliar with the line between personal trust and national survival. This is where the story enters its next chapter, Trong Thuy and Mi Chau, where war no longer kills with weapons, but with trust.
When Trong Thuy entered Co Loa, war temporarily faded from the horizon of Au Lac. The high walls stood firm, the Magic Crossbow remained unmatched, peace agreements were in place, and a marriage alliance between the two states created the sense that an era of confrontation had come to an end. In this atmosphere, Trong Thuy did not appear as an agent of conspiracy, but as a young husband living within the capital, gradually blending into the daily life of the Au Lac court. Mi Chau had grown up in peace, raised as a princess of a state that believed it had moved beyond the most brutal phases of warfare. She had never witnessed Co Loa under siege, nor seen the Magic Crossbow decide the fate of thousands in battle. To Mi Chau, the crossbow was a sacred symbol of royal authority, but not a line between survival and annihilation. This gap in political awareness placed her at the center of the tragedy. Trong Thuy, meanwhile, carried two roles that could not be reconciled. On one hand, he was the son of Chau, a ruler who had carefully calculated every step needed to defeat Au Lac without open war. On the other, he was a man living within Co Loa, with a private life and genuine emotions toward Mi Chau. The legend does not portray Trong Thuy as a purely deceitful figure, but as someone torn between political duty and personal affection. It was within this domestic space that the secret of the Magic Crossbow was gradually accessed. There were no interrogations, no acts of violence, only seemingly harmless questions and intimate exchanges of married life. Mi Chau, unprepared for the demands of state secrecy, unintentionally revealed the most vital asset of the Au Lac court. When the trigger of the crossbow was replaced, no one in Co Loa realized that its greatest military advantage was already gone. The tragedy of this story lies in the fact that neither of them set out to betray from the beginning. Mi Chau did not intend treason, and Trong Thuy was not driven solely by conspiracy. But history does not operate according to individual notions of good and evil. It moves by the consequences of choices. Once the secret was exposed, whether by innocence or intention, the fate of Au Lac was sealed. In folk memory, the image of Mi Chau scattering goose feathers along her path of flight carries profound symbolism. It was not merely a trail for Trong Thuy to follow, but a metaphor for misplaced trust, the belief that personal affection could exist apart from the fate of the nation. When that trust was exploited, the tragedy extended beyond one family to encompass the collapse of an entire state. By the time An Duong Vuong recognized the truth, it was already too late. Co Loa no longer had the Magic Crossbow to defend it. Chau's forces had breached the defensive lines, and Au Lac entered its final hours. In that moment, the story was no longer about love or betrayal, but about the painful confrontation between a king's responsibility and a father's despair. Yet the story of Trong Thuy and Mi Chau does not end here, for after emotion and politics collide, history still demands a final chapter, one in which every choice exacts its cost, a state disintegrates, and unavoidable lessons are etched into collective memory. When Chau's forces entered Co Loa for the final time, it was no longer a war in the conventional sense. The walls still stood, the moats and ramparts remained intact, yet the force that had once protected Au Lac was gone. The Magic Crossbow, the symbol of absolute military superiority, had lost its power to determine the outcome. As a result, The collapse of Au Lac unfolded rapidly, leaving little trace of prolonged resistance. This is a crucial point that must be acknowledged clearly. Au Lac did not fall because it was weak, but because it placed the entirety of its national strength on a single pillar. Once that pillar was removed, everything collapsed in a chain reaction. High walls became meaningless when the core weapon was neutralized. A large army lost its effectiveness when morale and confidence in victory had already disintegrated. In legend, An Duong Vuong fled south with Chau. Along the way, the golden turtle appeared and revealed that the enemy was not only ahead but directly behind him. This image carries profound symbolic meaning. When a state loses the ability to distinguish between the interests of the nation and those of the individual, even the closest bonds can become the cause of its downfall. The moment An Duong Vuong killed Chau should not be interpreted simply as a moral judgment. It represents the tragic instant of a man who was both king and father, forced to confront the consequences of a system he had not yet fully built. Chau's death did not save Au Lac, but it closed an era with a painful awakening. Personal affection cannot stand apart from the fate of the state. Afterward, An Duong Vuong followed the golden turtle into the sea, withdrawing from history as a figure suspended between reality and myth. This departure was not an escape, but the traditional way of closing a dynasty that had fulfilled its historical role. Au Lac fell, but it did not vanish without meaning. It left behind a lesson that later generations could not ignore. The greatest lesson of Au Lac lies not in military defeat, but in the limits of an early state. An Duong Vuong had advanced far beyond the era of the Hung kings. He built a capital, organized a standing army, and employed technological advantage. Yet he did not have time to construct institutions to safeguard power, to cultivate deep political awareness among successors, or to clearly separate family from the state. These shortcomings cannot be blamed on the individual, for they were constraints of the age itself. For this reason, Au Lac was not merely a failed dynasty, but a necessary historical experiment. From its collapse, Vietnamese history entered the long period of Chinese domination, a painful era yet, one that also fostered accumulated experience in governance, resistance, and national consciousness. Without Au Lac, there would have been no foundation of lessons that enabled the Vietnamese people to endure and recover across the centuries that followed. The breaking of the Magic Crossbow was not the end of history, but the force that pushed history into a more mature stage. Co Loa ceased to be a capital, yet became a foundational memory shaping Vietnamese concepts of state defense. And the tragedy of An Duong Vuong is not meant to condemn, but to remind us that nation-building is always a process paid for with both success and failure. Yet when the entire story is reconsidered, one fundamental question remains unresolved. Was An Duong Vuong a failed king, or the founder of the first true conception of statehood in Vietnamese history? This question cannot be answered through legend alone. It must be understood within the long continuum of the nation's historical development.
When An Duong Vuong and the state of Au Lac are placed within the long continuum of Vietnamese history, the most important question is not why this dynasty failed, but when it emerged, in what role it fulfilled. Au Lac did not last long, yet it occupied a pivotal position, standing between the semi-legendary era of Van Long and the harsh historical period that would stretch across the following millennia. Compared to the Hung kings, An Duong Vuong was the first ruler to confront directly the challenge of building and defending a state with clearly defined territory. Van Long relied on a loose alliance of tribes, suitable for an early age with limited external pressure. Au Lac was different.
It emerged at a time when major political entities were forming in the north, and warfare was no longer a series of small-scale conflicts, but wars of conquest. In this context, An Duong Vuong was, in many respects, ahead of his time. The citadel of Co Loa represents a leap forward in the organization of political and military space. The Magic Crossbow, though shaped by legend, reflects an early awareness of technological superiority in warfare. These elements place Au Lac alongside other early states in East and Southeast Asia of the same period, rather than portraying it as a backward community passively swept along by history. Yet precisely because it stood at a transitional stage, Au Lac carried internal contradictions it could not yet resolve. The state had taken shape, but its institutions were incomplete. Central authority had emerged, but political consciousness had not spread deeply enough. Military superiority existed, yet mechanisms to protect people, secrets, and continuity of power were not fully established. These limitations were not personal failures of An Duong Vuong, but structural constraints of a society moving beyond the pre-state phase. Viewed through this lens, An Duong Vuong is not a ruler to be judged in terms of right or wrong, but a historical figure to be understood. He did not merely inherit the legacy of Van Long, he left behind foundational lessons for later generations. A nation cannot endure by relying solely on fortifications and weapons. It requires governance systems, laws, and political awareness proportionate to the power it holds. The story of Au Lac also helps explain why later Vietnamese history consistently emphasized two principles: vigilance against external threats and discipline from within. From the Trong sisters and Li Bi to No Quyen and subsequent independent dynasties, the lesson of Co Loa remained quietly present, never allowing national strength to depend on a single individual or a single secret, and never letting peace obscure the line between survival and extinction. In cultural memory, An Duong Vuong, Mi Chau, and Trong Chi are not merely historical figures, but moral symbols. Beneath that moral layer lies something deeper, the political awakening of a community learning how to become a nation. It is this deeper dimension that keeps the story of Au Lac perpetually relevant, because it raises questions every era must confront. From today's perspective, it can be said that Au Lac failed in terms of longevity, but succeeded in historical significance. It left behind a legacy of thought, the courage to experiment, to build, and to pay the price. Without Co Loa, there would be no foundation for later military thinking. Without the breaking of the Magic Crossbow, there would be no profound awareness of secrecy and institutional safeguards. And without the tragedy of An Duong Vuong, Vietnamese history would lack one of its earliest lessons about the true cost of nation-building. Today, as the citadel of Co Loa remains only in traces, the story of Au Lac continues to live on, not as a tragic legend, but as a reminder that history exists not only to inspire pride, but to help us understand who we are and what we have endured. And from that point onward, the journey of Vietnamese history entered a longer, harsher, yet more resilient chapter, the journey of a people learning to survive, resist, and renew themselves across the ages.
The history of Au Lac did not end with a victory, but with a lesson that a nation is not built solely on high walls or powerful weapons, but on the ability to protect its core values from within. The citadel of Co Loa once stood firm, the Magic Crossbow once forced enemies to hesitate, yet would ultimately determine the fate of Au Lac lay not in its defenses, but in its people, and in the political awareness of its time. Looking back at the story of An Duong Vuong today, we do so not to judge the past, but to understand the path history has taken and the price paid for each stage in the growth of a nation. If these stories encourage you to reflect more deeply on Vietnamese history, continue with us in the chapters ahead, where the past is not only retold, but re-examined to better understand who we are today.
Thank you for your interest in the channel. I hope each video not only shares historical knowledge, but also helps you experience the depth, spirit, and cultural identity of Vietnamese history. If you find the content useful or have any suggestions for the channel or individual videos, please feel free to leave a comment. Your feedback will help improve future content. Enjoy the video and see you in the next stories of Vietnam's history.